speak to you today. Jerry and I have been talking about this subject of the integration of science with design and design with science. It's a subject near and dear to our hearts. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to share with you some of the ideas that I've been kind of mulling over the last couple of years, and what I've learned from the students and what I've learned about the design practice, about this integration of design and science. So I'm going to start with something that I realized recently. And this comes after lots of years of teaching, lots of years of reading, and my experience as a person and as an instructor. I really believe that if you want to change the world, be a designer. And I hope that my slides will kind of prove that out. So this is my premise, and I'll share with you how I came to this conclusion. So are any designers in the room? Are there any designers? 1, 2 designers? Okay. So for the rest of you who are not designers, I thought I would maybe tell you a little bit about what designers do. Designers start by gathering a lot of information. They investigate, they may gather materials, they may sketch, they may talk to people, they may observe. They do research that really amounts to gathering. They'll begin to make things. They'll prototype. They'll experiment. They'll eventually create a solution or create a direction that they want to go in. And most of the time it has to do with improving a current system. So they're looking to make things better or maybe make something entirely new. And the result of all of this is design. This is what we call design. Now, they often do it with scientists. This integration of science and design is not new. Designers have been adapting technology, adapting the sciences for human consumption, for human needs. And so this is my, I hope you enjoy this little photograph of scientists. Now this is a scientist's idea of what design is. This is a coffee maker done by scientists. I'm just kidding. I thought that was funny. So here's some examples of the intersection between design and science. Henry Dreyfuss was a very well-known designer. He designed this 20th Century Limited, applying the latest technology of the day, the steam engine, and made it useful, made it easy for people to use this new invention. He's also the designer of this thermostat. Some of you may recognize this thermostat. Something I didn't know. Can you think why it's round as opposed to rectangular?
Easier to turn the dial.
You would think so. That's certainly what I thought.
And also design-wise, if you punch a hole in the wall, it's easier if it's circular than having a square.
Exactly. The installer didn't have to use a level. They could put it anywhere on the wall and it wouldn't look strange next to a door jamb or a corner. So that's why it's circular. I thought it was a functional. It had to do with the function. It actually has to do with kind of the aesthetic of having this thermostat on a wall. And I would call this an early example of interface design. It's kind of a smart meter, but it was designed many, many years ago. Raymond Loewy, taking refrigeration, the latest technology in refrigeration, and applying it to a home-based refrigeration unit. Dieter Rams, who just recently, Saturday, he was at Art Center. He's a very famous German designer. Started out as an architect. This is his coffin radio turntable. They called it the Snow White coffin because it has kind of a clear lid. But again, technology being made useful by design. How many of you have used this brown shaver? Yes. So that's another Dieter Rams design. he collaborated with some material scientists on the co-molding of two different kinds of plastic. So again, there is a long-standing relationship between design and scientists. Oliver Alto and his Pymeo chair. This is one, the black area is one piece of wood that a new manufacturing technology allowed to be bent into this kind of elaborate shape. Recently, Eastman scientists worked with palm designers to come up with a plastic that had the properties of glass. They wanted hyper transparency and also shine, but it's a plastic. Now designers talk a lot about systems thinking. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. So designers are looking beyond just the making part of design and application part of design to thinking about designs in terms of larger systems. Apple is certainly an example of looking at information and the communication of information and what these interfaces look like. Jonathan Ive is the designer who is the lead designer for Apple and is actually a Dieter Rams fan. You could really see the influence of Dieter Rams in the work of Apple. Nike has in-house designers. They work very closely with materials scientists. The Aeron chair, which many of you probably have at home. This was the, they wanted to lightweight the materials. And they also wanted to make it repairable. And it required a new engineering technique. This was the largest piece of injection molded polyethylene. So it required a lot of work between the designer and the scientists. Now we're thinking of comprehensive design. As we're thinking about environmental impacts and social impacts, design is broadening its context. It's not anymore just about that radio or that phone. It's about who's using it, where are the materials coming from, what are the manufacturing processes, what happens to the product once it's no longer in use. And we use the term comprehensive design to describe this kind of bigger picture thinking that designers are doing now. Patagonia is a good example of a company that really thinks big picture. You can go to their site and look at a product, and you can pull up a map, and it will tell you where the materials came from, where it was sewn, where it was warehoused. They call it the Footprint Chronicles. And then lastly, of course, this desire for sustainability, this desire to meet our needs without impacting the environment, without impacting society, and benefiting economies. This is all now part of design. So you can see the design has really expanded over the last several years. Toyota is a company that goes at sustainability by using a scientific method called life cycle analysis, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And Nestle is also a company that is developing in-house life cycle assessment capability. They have life cycle scientists that are going to do this kind of comprehensive analysis for all of their product lines. So moving forward, companies are beginning to think more broadly, use a scientific method, but it's going to be up to the designer to take the information from that analysis and actually apply it to the products. So what we're basically left with is design and sustainability. These are the two major goals now for design. So what do designers do? They make it recyclable, they make it biodegradable, they make it out of a renewable material. Design has not been very good or imaginative in solving the sustainability part of this. And as we know that if you make something recyclable but there's nowhere to recycle it, that's design failure. If you make it biodegradable but you don't ensure that it's going to be biodegradable, how does that address sustainability? Soy-based, we know that that is often the get-out-of-jail-free card for design, or soy-based ink. But most of us have read about the perils of agriculture or farming of soy. So design, much as it would like to provide for sustainability, it really hasn't been able to do it. And what we've ended up with, while we were aligned with science before, now that we're designing in a broader context, there is no more alignment between science and designers. And that is a really big problem. So our goals right now, an imperative really, is that we must optimize design. We must optimize design so that environmental and social conditions can be addressed, as well as long-term sustainability. Another way that I like to put this to students is, you're not just responsible for minimizing impacts and addressing sustainability. Reframe how you think of design. What if the purpose of design was to make sustainable development possible? That is the purpose of design, not to make a new iPhone, not the latest shoe, not to make it out of a renewable material, but to provide for sustainable development. That is the purpose of design. I mentioned this to Jerry and Tom we had dinner before our meeting here today, that the definition of sustainability, which has been around since 1987, has recently changed. This may be familiar to you. This is the so-called Brundtland definition of sustainability, which says that sustainability is about meeting our present-day needs without impacting the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Well, on March 21st of this year, some scientists have proposed a new definition, which I like very much. They talk about sustainable development in the Anthropocene. So we are now recognizing that we live in an era, an epoch that has been created by humans, the influence of humans, and they're calling it the Anthropocene. And they go further that say that sustainability is about meeting needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system, on which the welfare of current and future generations depends. So finally, they've put Earth into the sustainability definition. They recognize we're in the Anthropocene, they recognize the Earth, and they also recognize that our sustainability, human sustainability, depends on the Earth's sustainability. And I'm very much in favor of this new definition, so wanted to share it with you. So what do we want to do? We want to optimize design. We want to optimize design by using scientific and life cycle data and assessment to inform and guide decision making. We need to bring science back to design. And we want to optimize science by more effectively communicating relevant information to decision makers. So it's really a joint effort now between design and science that is beginning. It's in its infancy, but I really believe that unless we do this, unless we have this marriage between design and science, long-term sustainability will simply not be possible. So how do you do this? How do you create a more robust and direct relationship between designers and scientists? And I want to do a quick exercise that has to do with your bag. So everybody have your pencils and take that little sheet. Okay. So it's marked 1 through 8. So go to the number 1. And we're gonna fly through this. We're gonna go through this really quickly. But it will illustrate I hope, what I mean. I'm going to tell you that there's a peanut in that bag. Sorry about that. There's a peanut in that bag. And number one, I want you to draw the peanut that you imagine. So this is the peanut you have in your head. Draw the peanut you imagine. And you're going quickly here. And number two, I want you to open up the bag, do not look inside. Simply go in with your fingers and feel the peanut. So now you have a little more scientific data. You have more data, and I want you to draw it again. You have more information. Your drawing should probably be different. Okay. Now when you're done with that, unfold the sheet, and in number 3, I want you to take the peanut out of the bag and draw it. So now you not only have imaginary data, you have tactile data, now you have visual data, and draw it again. Isn't the peanut so much more interesting than what you imagined? I mean, it's, oh no? I'm always amazed at how much more complex a peanut looks than what I think. In number 4, I want you to draw a caricature with one proviso: it may not be Mr. Peanut. No canes, no top hats, or anything like that. But what I'm asking for you to do is exaggerate the peanut in some way that it becomes a caricature of itself. Okay. In number 5, I want you to say what your peanut's life was like. You're basically creating a story about your peanut. Is it a male or female? Is it young or old? Where did it grow up? Give it a name. Name your peanut. And then when you've done that, in the next panel, I want you to break open the peanut and draw all of the different parts. Break it up into as many different component parts as you can. How many different types of materials are in the peanut? And sketch those. So how many parts do you have? So you have the shell. You have the skin. Can the shell be broken? Can you see any more materials than just one material on the shell? Okay, so it has a lining. Sometimes it's a little more obvious. It's a very kind of almost a mother of pearl lining. Okay. And then how many peanuts do you have? And can they be broken down? Okay. Now, if I were to say to you, given what you know about this peanut, kind of the properties of the peanut, including the shell, could you design something with using peanut as a raw material? Could you figure out a use for the peanut? Could you make something out of it? Most of you are kind of nodding your head. That is basically where design is right now. We know something about materials. We know something about the properties. We can experiment. We can make things out of things. But can you design for sustainability knowing what you know about this peanut? No. And that's the state of design right now. We don't know enough. We need that kind of scientific information about where the peanut was grown, any additives, what was the water use, how was it harvested, where was it warehoused, what are you going to do with the peanut. Those are all things that the designer needs to know if you're going to consider the context or look at the peanut as a material in a comprehensive sense. So what I want you to do in the next rectangle is, whoops. Okay, I want you to draw what you think the life cycle of peanut butter is. Okay? So you're going to sketch, very roughly, what's the life cycle of peanut butter? It's organic. No stir peanut butter from, let's see, where was this made? This, well, it came out of New York, though I doubt if the peanuts came from New York. Probably Georgia or someplace like that, okay? So what's the life cycle of a peanut? Where would you start?
The ground.
Okay, you start with the ground, right? When you
Analysis of the nutrition.
Okay, so you would do an analysis first about how to grow the peanut, right?
Research information.
Okay, so you would need to know, does the soil have to be prepared in any way? Is machinery used? Is there fuel? Do you need fuel for the machinery? Are you going to put any additives into the soil? Are you watering yet? Are you using any other amendments in the soil? Then when you plant the peanut, what does cultivation look like on the life cycle? Are you using other materials? Are you using anything to control weeds? You know, again, what is the amount of water? Is the water flowing off the field? Is it evaporating? Is it running off? What's in that water? When you harvest it, how are you going to harvest it? You know, what are the materials going into the harvesting and the materials coming out? That's the kind of detail that the designer must now know about every material they use if they're going to design for sustainability. It's pretty intimidating. It's pretty intimidating.
And you also include water systems if they're going to use tubing?
When you do a life cycle assessment, you draw a boundary around the analysis, and you may decide to leave the actual infrastructure for the water supply out of the analysis. But there are, these are called LCAs, life cycle assessments or life cycle analyses. They will even include the fuel for the worker to get to the field. They'll even include the airplane trips that the salespeople of the company take to sell that product. So you can see that when we say comprehensive gets big really, really fast. So you need a management tool. You need a scientific method like life cycle assessment to gather that information. So this is kind of what a life cycle assessment or the steps in a life cycle assessment look like. It starts with raw material and it goes all the way through the use and then eventual disposal of a product. And once you have all of that data collected, the scientist makes an evaluation as to what the potential environmental consequences of every step of that life cycle assessment are. So they may evaluate it on the basis of air pollution, water pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, habitat disruption. You go in and you look at it from the lens of what kind of environmental impacts do you want to understand so you can make better design decisions. This is how design is progressing in this direction. And current students in design, this is what they're being encouraged to know and in some cases being taught. But they're not going to become life cycle experts. They have to work with scientists that are experts in this. And that's where that relationship becomes very critical. Otherwise, we cannot design for sustainability. Otherwise, we're just guessing. We don't want to guess. We want to know. So how we do this, there's a methodology that I've been developing that links life cycle assessment with design. And I have a little graphic that I can share with you. If you look at design, it usually starts with an idea, and then it moves through a design process, and you have an outcome. Now, at the same time, somebody's generating life cycle assessments over here. The problem is the two aren't talking to each other. The scientists are generating the data, the designers are kind of going on with their design, and what we need to do is to link these two circles. So what we're doing at Art Center is we're using what's called a goals to strategies methodology. And the designer will look at the results of a life cycle assessment, and they will formulate goals for their design. So they may see that there's a significant impact having to do with the kind of dye that was used on the packaging. So their goal may be to eliminate that impact, and then they list all the different kinds of strategies that they could use to do it. And that informs the design. They don't guess at reducing impacts. It's a very targeted, rigorous, kind of robust process. You can appreciate that for designers it's a little hard to do because they're used to a little kind of more open way of creation. And now we're saying, oh, creativity is good, but you have to also understand the rudimentary kind of science of the system. So that's how we've come up with this way of doing it. I just recently finished a big research project with Nestle, and one of the ways that what we propose to Nestle is that they need a visual alphabet to help the life cycle scientists communicate the results of the analysis to people outside of science. So we created a set of icons. The system is at the top. Here's some more of the icon sets. And down here at the bottom, you can see where it's actually applied. This is the process tree of, they were investigating glass baby food jars versus plastic baby food jars. And this is an LCA of spray-dried coffee. And this looks very different from what the actual data in a life cycle assessment looks like. This is what a life cycle assessment looks like. So we're proposing that if we want the designers to actually understand the information, perhaps a visual alphabet would be a useful communication tool. We also proposed a strategy deck. Once you have your goals for the redesign, designers then will want to apply different strategies to their concept development. But they don't know all the possible strategies. For example, if you want to remove dye from a packaging assignment, it may be using an alternative or using less of that material or coming up with a completely different kind of packaging solution. So we propose these cards that designers could use to prompt them with ideas. And we also created an online version so they could play the cards on the computer, as well as I brought the physical deck actually with me too if you're interested in seeing it. And we always link the strategies back to the analysis, because what we don't want to lose is the connection to the science. We don't ever want to make that communication end. We want the designer always designing, recognizing what the underlying science is. And then we also took the LCA itself, the life cycle assessment, and created a more friendly version, an online version of the document. Again, this is what these documents look like. Here's an LCA of the plastic pots. They look like this. And this was our proposal. This is the splash page. I had to take the name Nestle off. You can't share this with anybody, still. It's under review. But somebody could go into the software program, they could choose a product, add things to the scope, and then the data would come up, but in a form that's understandable. And you'd always have on the right-hand side the process tree, a diagram of where that fits within the process as a point of reference. Here's manufacturing. Here would be another one. And then these are the impacts. Again, you can see much easier to understand and access. But we would never remove the full LCA from this documentation. We're not trying to dumb down the science. We're simply trying to extract the readily useful information for the purpose of design decision making. That's our whole goal. And we also wanted to do a little thing on the right-hand side where if you're looking at a document, you could find out who else has been reading it and who the experts are, so you could have someone to have a conversation with about the information. So, in conclusion, in this very kind of rapid-fire way, I really think design is uniquely positioned to take on the role and challenge of reimagining what our future is, but in cooperation with the scientists who are studying specific things, very, very closely. Design needs that information, people need that information, and the designers can make it possible to use that information to the benefit of all of us, including the Earth. So, thank you. Was that fast enough?
All right, can you hear me? Yes. Great. So I'm going to take a different sort of tack at this. I run a design agency, and I have worked a great deal with eminent scientists on many things. I'm primarily a communication designer, exhibits, graphics, movies, other kinds of things. I've done a few products. We often create products in the creation of exhibits, but we make one of them because you only need one machine in your exhibit. So it's a somewhat different approach. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is designing for communication about behavioral change. And so the title is intentionally in large letters, Mad Scientists and Crazy Artists, and in small type, and the Design of Environmental Communications. Because popular culture gives us lots and lots of images of mad scientists, and lots of images of crazy artists, right? The whole sort of mythology that has grown around Van Gogh cutting off his ear as a crazy artist is something I certainly grew up with as a kid, as an art student. And so the question I sometimes wonder about is, has anybody seen a designer? What do they look like? You. Well, okay. Welcome. We have two of us here tonight. At least two.
Not wearing all black.
That's right. Which is basically to mislead you and make you think I'm not a designer.
You have jeans on though.
I do have jeans on, but so do ranchers, so that's a little misleading. So I've been sort of struck with the question of what is design, and I really like the way Hedren approached it, because as I was putting these slides together, I was thinking, do we really know what a designer is? Do we really know what a designer does? And the most interesting definition I ever heard about exhibit and communication design came from a scientist who ran the Utah Science Center. This was his definition. We are engineering insights. Now, this is interesting to me because scientists are creating knowledge resources for us, right? They're helping us understand the world in ways that we can put to use. Did I lose this?
Yeah. Did you turn it off?
No. I just tried to move it.
Who designed that?
the design of everyday things. Okay?
Yeah.
All right, it's working. Great. I'm going to leave it here so I don't cause more trouble. So we're engineering insights, and this is something that to me is a very clear dividing line between what designers do, what scientists do, and what artists do. As an artist, and I was trained in art, I'm a musician, I make art, I'm a storyteller, right? But I'm telling stories that in ways that I imagine them, and it's sort of understood that the beholder, the listener or the reader, is going to have their own interpretation based on what they bring to it, and that's just fine. That's just fine. There's really no requirement that I communicate anything in particular when I'm making art. And when I'm a scientist, if I were a scientist, I'm really trying to understand something about the way the world works. And the communication of that is secondary to really developing the understanding of it. A designer's job is to work sort of in between these two worlds. And I really sort of see us as wedged in the middle, because we're using all the tools of art, but we're not using them as freely as artists do. We're using them with a very, very narrow and specific purpose that's usually given to us by our clients or by the problem we're trying to solve. And our job is to engineer a change of a perception in the minds of our audiences, which is a really interesting and complicated and challenging thing to do. And if you want to make it even harder, and this comes up in sustainability all the time, is the challenge of actually engineering behavioral change. How do we use the tools that Edwin was talking about to actually encourage or even either consciously or unconsciously guide people to behave differently than they do now? That's a very high bar. But it's a bar that advertisers and product designers and architects confront every single day. And I just love the cover of this book. And how do you do that is something I added. That's not the cover of this book. The book is called The Design of Everyday Things. And it's fascinating to me that the cover of this is a teapot where the handle and the spout for the boiling water are on the same side. Right? Have a nice day. But this gets right to the point with design, right? Because when we're designing something, we're designing, and this is for products, but it's also true of communications, we're designing for the ways people actually behave all the time anyway. And one of my absolute favorite pieces of communication design gets right to the point. This is a design for an ad for Purell, the stuff you can squirt onto your hands to disinfect them without using any water. And the ad tells the whole story at a glance, right? It's like you're putting on a latex glove, but it's your skin. As if you could peel that away when it gets dirty and your hand is still clean. The brilliance of this ad in expressing what Purell is supposed to be all about is that it begins with a very natural behavior, and it gives it a little bit of a nudge, right? We all want to protect our hands with gloves. We all want to wash our hands. And so giving you this nudge that says, guess what? Use Purell, and you're basically doing that without having to feel it. That's what an effective advertisement is really trying to do. And it does it with tremendous simplicity, and it's much easier to do that, to start with where we already are and give us a little nudge that feels sort of intuitive and natural, than it is to try to start us off from scratch with a new understanding. That's a challenge. Here's another great example. Start with our own perceptions and then give those a nudge. The genius of this billboard is the way it's structured. It only says quick plan, right? That's it. Quickplan.com. But you know exactly what it's trying to tell you. And it's telling you all that because it's feeding into the perceptions that the creators of this know that we already have. And it's also feeding into the perceptions that the creators of this know that our loved ones have about us and about what we're doing, right? Quitting smoking is a hard thing to do, breaking an addiction, and quite often people decide to quit smoking because they've either had a crisis and they know they're not going to live very long if they don't quit, or their loved ones have finally gotten through to them and they realize that there's a consequence in their relationships that they don't want to bear, or for people that they really care about. This speaks directly to that at an intuitive level because the designers were so obvious and so simple in preying on that and just giving it a little bit of a push. Sometimes advertisers do it by giving our self-image a nudge. I love this particular billboard from Nike. Yesterday, you said tomorrow. Did I run today? I better go out and buy another pair of Nike shoes. I may not wear them, but I want them because I don't want to be that person who failed to get out of bed at 5 o'clock and do my exercise, right? Nike knows that many of us aspire to be that person who is unafraid to go out there and put themselves through what it takes. That's our self-image today. It's very powerful in popular culture, even though most people never use Nike shoes for what they were originally designed for. That doesn't matter to Nike so much, but it matters to the advertising effectiveness of this piece of design. So you'll notice here that there's nothing about the product. And there's really nothing about the benefits of this behavior, right? The advertising communication, the nudge on our perception is all about the way we perceive ourselves already. So they've honed in on that and they've just given it a little push in order to suggest that we behave differently. This company has been brilliant at this, as Hedren said. Start with our values and give them a nudge. We all want to be that free spirit. We're all sort of, unless you're the guy who plays PC on the old Mac versus PC ads, right? He doesn't really want to be a free spirit. And that's what they're telling us. But there's nothing about what an iPod does here. It's all expressed in the carefree happiness of this person dancing with an attitude, right? That's what design is. Design is about the decisions, really, to choose the things to nudge, and then finding a visual expression to actually make that nudge work on people. In other words, we're in the business of manipulating psychology. That's what we do for a living. We may be very overt about it in our thinking, we may be very intuitive about it, but that's ultimately what we're doing when we do design. And I don't know that there's any company that's been more robust and thorough in building themselves into the world's either largest or second largest business by doing exactly this kind of thing. Apple spends, I don't know how many hours fussing over the design of something that they make so that it feels completely intuitive to use, right? They are masters. You know, it used to be you got a computer and you got a big old book and you had to read it. But if you've used Apple products for any length of time, they don't even come with books anymore. They might come with a color picture that shows you a few things that are new. That's all. The assumption is that it's got to be such an intuitive interface to use and such a pleasing and transparent experience that it's going to be obvious to you what to do. Now that's certainly not where Microsoft comes from, right? Microsoft, I mean, they're getting there, but they're following because they don't really understand that deep down, those of us who use this machine don't want to have to think about this machine, right? We want to do what we want to do. And so they design, what the designers are doing is figuring out how we behave, how we intuitively interact, and then designing a machine that works with that rather than trying to get us to behave differently in order to use the machine. That's design. And when you do that well, the reason I asked, did you ever see a designer? I've often thought that when the designer does their job well, the solution should seem so obvious that everybody says, well, of course they came up with that, right? That's when you know your design is right. Because it seems so intuitive and so obvious that anybody could have done it. It's not true. It took a long time to get there in most cases. But the designer's hand disappears. You know, you see Picasso's hand in a painting. You see Picasso's work or Michelangelo's work in the sculpture of David. You don't really see a designer's hand when they've done their job beautifully because it just feels obvious to you. Now, let's get to the point where designers and scientists interact. Because what I've just described to you is not the way scientists go about the work they do and the way they present that work to the world. This is the late Dwayne McGruer, a good friend of mine, who was a member of the National Academy of Engineering. There is an aerodynamics physical law called McGruer's law. So you get the idea. He kind of contributed a lot to his field. And he and I were writing a chapter together for an instruction book for outings leaders about navigation in the wilderness. And so Matt did the first draft, and it was long, scientific, and I hacked it all up into everyday language and shipped it back to him. And he called me, and there was this, we were talking about it, and I said, well, we have to take that out. We've got to change that or no one's going to understand it. And there was this long, pregnant pause on the phone, and I thought, okay, I've really stepped in it now. And all of a sudden, I heard a chuckle on the other end of the phone. And this is what Max said. You know, I've worked on dozens of National Academies reports, and never once did it occur to us that anyone would actually have to understand what we wrote. This is why designers matter. and so it's almost as if the worldview of this kind of scientific communication, which is really about education. It's not about advertising, it's not about marketing, it's not about that quick, intuitive grasp and you move on. It's about education, and this is sort of my pictorial model of that worldview. That's how these people see us. Me, no me, no me. Walk me through the physical chemical changes, interactions occurring on the surface of the ocean with dissolved CO2. On the surface ocean that reduce the availability of compounds used by marine organisms to build structures, skeletons, and shells, and how the potential impact of increased fossil fuel burning and deforestation on marine food webs. Come on, let's get to it. Is this us? Is that you? Well, maybe you. You're here tonight. But the people you left at home, is this how they're approaching scientific information? I don't think so. That model sort of assumes that this is us. We are empty beakers that somebody can pour knowledge in. We even know how much information this particular person can absorb, 250 millimeters of information, right? And so now I'm kind of having fun at scientists' expense here, but it's to draw a caricature because it's easier to see that way. So if you ask, I've done this many times, I've asked a scientist a simple question about what's the impact of that. Here's the thought structure. Oh, you want environmental action? Well, first, let me tell you how the world works and about interacting Earth systems like the carbon cycle and its impact with interactions with biological systems, in hopes that you will someday use this information to make wiser choices in all of your civic and personal affairs. Really? Are you going to answer my question? Are you going to help me know what to do? Not so much, no. Because the worldview is to give you the raw materials from which you can then make those decisions. And I sort of poke fun at scientists. I am not a person who believes that scientists are failing at communication. I'm a person who believes it's not a scientist's job to be good at communication. It's the job of somebody who works with them to help them be more effective in their communications, right? So a friend of mine who's an eminent scientist, Richard Somerville, who has spoken here, told me once, he's a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Prize for their work in helping the world understand at sort of the gold standard level what we know about climate change, where we're headed, what the impacts will be. And he describes the IPCC reports as raw ore from which to refine the nuggets of communication. Well, let me show you what that raw ore looks like, because these are some graphics that they present to policymakers around the world in hopes that they will make wiser decisions in all of their personal and civic affairs. So this one says, you know what, we've got a problem. You can see that, right? It's pretty serious. And you know what, it's getting worse. And it's either going to get worse along one of these lines you see here, or maybe in those gray things off on the side. But it's really getting worse. And not only that, we're facing some serious risks. And you know, the risks are getting worse too. And we could look at them in more detail if you really want to know them, because in fact we know a great deal about some of these risks in specificity, but fortunately, if you want to solve the problem, we can show you how to do it. Got it? That's ore, right? It takes a great deal of refining to do it. Now, if you leave designers alone and say, go interpret that, there's no telling what you'll get. Because designers generally aren't trained to deal with any of that kind of ore, right? We're not good refiners of ore in general. And so what happens with designers is they'll take a chunk of it. They'll sort of get one insight that triggers something for them, and they'll run with it, and they'll just sort of drop everything else. And so you get an exhibit or a graphic or a movie or something that ends up from a scientific perspective being wildly inaccurate or misleading or exaggerated, but it's a beautiful piece of design, right? So as Hedren said, it's in the interaction, it's in the going back and forth between the scientists and the designers that you can get some better examples. And I'm just going to show you a few from projects we've done where we've actually collaborated with scientists to try to take some of this or take all of that material and express it in a different way. So here's the first one. This green line is CO2 in the atmosphere through all the ice ages where it's at its bottom and the warm periods in between ice ages where it's at its top. And it says over 650,000 years, CO2 in our atmosphere has never been above this line until now. And there we are today. In fact, that was a few years ago. We'd had to add yet another grid line to get there. Okay? This is the instant gestalt about, oh, today's different from anything else. What are the impacts? Well, these are some impacts pulled out of the IPCC report that are most robust in their projections. So, and I know you can't read it from where you're seated, but the world has already warmed this much, and because the greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere a long time, we're committed to this much even if we stop today. This is where world leaders say we ought to stop, but we're not really doing anything to get there. And that's where we could be later in the century if we don't. And so you can pick your poison and look at some of the consequences that scientists believe are convinced will happen. For example, at 2 degrees, 9 to 31% of species are committed to extinction. That doesn't sound like happy news to me, but that's where the scientists have said, you know, or the politicians rather than scientists, it's really politicians who said, let's draw a line in the sand there, but it's only drawn in sand, so it's not so good. Okay, so the next image is, well, what's it going to take to stop at this level and not go beyond it? Well, if you look at all the CO2 we're emitting, this is a plot of 3 trajectories. If we want to have a 3 out of 4 chance of not going through 2 degrees, 3 out of 4, not 100%. This is all about probabilities. And I don't really like 3 out of 4. It doesn't feel very secure to me, but it's better than nothing. If we were to stop, now this was done in 2010, so we're already past this green dot. The green dot would be where the world would have to start reducing CO2 to follow that sort of gentle curve down to the year 2050. If we go past it, it gets steeper, and if we go past it, and this is only to about, 2015 before we start reducing. You go out to 2022, it becomes like the double black diamond run at Mammoth. You better be an expert at cutting CO2 if you want to get there. This is a way to say, guess what? We have an awful lot of work to do, which is why that new definition of sustainability, I think, is so important, because it's an attempt to say, hey, this isn't just about some abstraction. This is about our lives, right? So there's one other piece to this puzzle, and that is, because invariably when people see this, they start to say, wow, what can I do? Where do I fit into this? And you know, this is sort of, this isn't quantitative, this is qualitative. But if you want to build a new infrastructure, it takes a long time to take effect, right? There's a lot of work to do to build a new energy infrastructure. Buildings last 40 to 100 years. So to replace all the buildings in the world is going to take a long time. New technologies take a fair amount of time to develop and then penetrate the market. The average time it takes for a new motor vehicle technology to really penetrate the market ranges from 15 to 25 years. So those of you who are driving Priuses today, good job, but understand that they aren't going to become a dominant force in our marketplace for a long time to come, because it just takes that long unless we agree to incentivize the market in a big way. However, it turns out using energy more efficiently is our ace in the hole for immediate results, because anybody can cut their energy use a lot very quickly, and you can sort of do it right now. And all the experts, from Stephen Chu, Secretary of Energy, to others, have said The cheapest, most available, new renewable energy resource in the world is energy efficiency. It's eliminating waste from what we're doing today. Okay, so that was an attempt to begin the design process, and I would call this a work in process. There are parts of it that are terrible. But it's an effort to mine that ore and start to pull some things out of it that tell a coherent story. So I want to talk just a little bit now, shifting gears to the way we think about, way designers sort of think about the way people process information that's different from that model I showed from the scientific education worldview. And the question is, do we laugh at Homer and other comedic figures because they're idiots? Kinda. But we really laugh at them because they're just like us. They are a mirror that exaggerates the way we all process information. So Homer is asked by Marge to be given a pink shirt to wear to work. He says, I can't wear a pink shirt. I'm not popular enough. Right? What's he doing there? He's an overloaded guy. Like we all are. He's taking in too much information. He trusts his belief. He's frightfully concerned with his self-image and his social standing. He oversimplifies. He responds to his emotions, and he banks on his past experiences. These are sort of natural neurological responses to our world. This is what we're dealing with as a communications raw material. We are all bombarded by way too much information, especially about the environment. And social scientists will tell you we all have sort of a finite pool of worry. We can't worry about everything. So we have to sort of prioritize what we're going to worry about, right? And so when you're taking on an issue big like climate or the state of the oceans or the state of agricultural viability in the world or something like that, there are many things that can keep us from engaging in this, one of which is intentional misinformation. James Inhofe, the Attorney General Cuccinelli from Virginia going after Michael Mann and other scientists, and all of that kind of stuff. Well-funded efforts to keep us all confused and disengaged. But even so, even more importantly, every message has to compete with our own human nature. Our own inattention, our higher priorities and our finite pool of concern. We tend to deal with things that are immediate and tangible rather than abstract and distant. We're preoccupied with things, we misunderstand things, we trust certain informants and we distrust others, and we all have a different array of people we trust. Those who tend to be concerned about these issues greatly tend to be people who trust scientists. Those who tend to be disbelievers of this stuff tend to be people who don't trust scientists. All of this is what our sort of pool of material is that designers are constantly working with. So some strategies are to begin where we already are. That's why the handle and the spout are on different sides of the teapot, not on the same side, right? In first aid, we say, address your victim's chief complaint first, because if you don't address their chief complaint, they're never going to trust you. Hi, how you doing? You look like you need help. Can I help you? Yeah, I'm really in a lot of pain. I feel like my arm is broken. Well, let me do a head-to-toe exam first, and we'll get to your arm later. Goodbye. First thing you do is you deal with the person's pain, you let them know you're paying attention to them, then you do your head-to-toe exam, right? Well, we know something about, at least as far as climate research goes, we know something about what people's chief complaints are on the climate question. Because the people who do these kind of public surveys have surveyed and told us this. What would be the one question you would ask an expert on climate change if they were in the room with you and you had that chance? Those who are most alarmed and concerned about climate change want to know what we can do to reduce global warming. Those who are either disengaged altogether and don't know anything about it, or they're a little bit more cautious about their concern, want to know what sort of harm global warming is going to cause. And those who are utterly dismissive, they don't think it's real, or they're really doubtful about it, they don't think government should get involved in this kind of thing, want to know, how do you, kind of almost cynically, how do you know, right? Now, it's interesting to me that almost all of our environmental communication so far has focused on that last question. How do we know it's real? Look at the chief complaints we're ignoring as communicators. It strikes me as a huge opportunity that we have yet to exploit. Now, when you're going to get in there and figure out how to communicate these things, there are a couple of other guidelines. First is, don't make us adopt your values in order to engage with you on this topic, right? Communicators want to engage the values that you already hold. I interviewed a guy who's a conservative policy wonk, who's an advocate for getting off fossil fuels and changing the tax code. He wants a carbon tax, but he's a conservative policy advocate. And I asked him, why do you want to do that? Do you think climate change is real? He said, there's no doubt it's a problem. But if you come at me and tell me that that means we need big government regulation to interfere with our lives and take our choices away, I'm just going to tell you it can't possibly be real. That's just too offensive to me. But if you tell me we're going to have a tax on carbon so it levels the playing field, and so as a consumer I can choose whether I want to buy gasoline or electricity for my car or ride the bus or walk, you've increased my liberty. I like that. So if I want to communicate with conservatives, I'm glad I know that, right? Because I don't want him to have to adopt my worldview that says regulation is better than market incentives, or I'm never going to get anywhere with him. And we're not doing that enough, I think, in our communication about environmental issues. We tend to talk to ourselves. Another piece of social science research looked at the characteristics of all issues that become top national priorities for policymakers. And for every single one of them, from gun control to abortion rights to Social Security to tax code, every single one of them shares 5 characteristics in common. For every one that becomes a top priority, a majority of Americans believe that the problem is real, that the problem is caused by people, that the problem is going to be more harmful than it is helpful, that we can solve the problem. No point rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? So if we can't solve it, why bother? And people are confident that their views are robust. We have focused really on, is the problem real? Is it caused by people? And will the effects be harmful? And we've done very, very little communication about our capacity to solve this problem or the confidence people have in their views. A really interesting piece of social science research says, this is real evidence, that when people believe that scientists agree that climate change is real and a problem, people tend to become more concerned about it and want policy action. It's the belief that scientists are in agreement that drives public concern. And so I'm working with a communications guy at a firm in Washington, D.C., who is trying to marshal the big science societies to make one simple statement in a communications campaign. Guess what? 97.5% of publishing climate scientists agree that climate change is real and caused by people. Period. End of story. And guess what? You can't get them to do it. That's a huge missed opportunity, because that would turn the page. And interestingly, the deniers also know this. And so the famous Frank Luntz memo from during the Bush years, Frank Luntz was a Republican strategist who wrote a memo that leaked. He was writing to Republican politicians, and he said, the door on public belief or sort of ambivalence about climate change is closing, but it's not closed yet. As soon as the public believes scientists are in agreement on climate change, they're going to demand that the government act on it. So your mission as Republicans is to keep the public confused and to believe that scientists are in disagreement. Hence the denier campaign, right? It's a designed, they got designers too, it's a designed strategy to keep people from engaging. So in a world like this, help us become more confident. Tell us that there's something that can be done about this problem and what we can do. And if you're going to tell me what to do, please, please, please don't show me a light bulb. Please. Because the solutions have to be commensurate with the scale of the challenge, right? Not only is the CFL one of the ugliest pieces of design work ever created, it just is horrible looking. Can you imagine one of those going off over somebody's head to say, I had an idea? No, you had a piece of spaghetti. You need to straighten that out. It's just god-awful, but it also looks trivial. And Al Gore made a great movie, An Inconvenient Truth, that came out in 2007, and it was really great piece of design to communication right up until the end, when he said, here are some things you can do. Change one light bulb. Take a shopping bag with you to the store. And you sort of sit there and you think, holy cow, Civilization is on the brink. I love movies where civilization's on the brink of destruction. I just don't want to be in one. And you're telling me that the solution is to change a light bulb and take a light bulb to the store. There's an awful lot more we can do than that, and we need to talk about what that is. So, my last slide, summary slide. This is sort of my charge to designers, and I present this to scientists and institutions that are communicating, businesses that are communicating. And the core of it is surprise us. We don't want to hear the same thing over again, right? We want to be surprised. Get to the point. Don't tell us how the world works first. Tell us your conclusion and then explain why. Make it clear. Don't tell me about all those uncertainties first. Distill, and this is really the challenge where scientists and designers have to work together, because neither one of us is any good doing it ourselves. But when we collaborate, magic can happen. And because we have to take all of this wealth of raw ore and distill it down to a gem that people can understand, that not only is a gem they can understand, but is accurate enough to be valid, right? A designer can't do that part, and a scientist can't do the distilling. So this is why designers live in an interesting place. Make it feel intuitive. Make it feel so intuitive that it doesn't feel painful to learn. I don't feel like I have to make a huge investment to learn. That doesn't mean you can't have a book of text for those who are the kind of personalities that will dig into it. But the point has to come across at a glance, just like that Purell skin glove did. You got to get the point right away, and then those who want to learn more can dig in. Make it unexpected. Surprise is one of the most valuable tools in storytelling. A plot twist, right? Where suddenly the character does something completely unexpected. It throws you. Well, the same is true in design of almost anything. Who would have thought you could carry something this big in your pocket and listen to 1,000 songs? What a surprise! And just gesture across something and have your computer do something for you. Or push a button and talk to it and get an answer. These are surprises, right, in the product world. Well, communications can be surprising too. So surprise us and give us hope. Sort of the three most, this is according to some research studies, the three really important questions for communicators to address about environmental issues are prove that it's real, or make me believe that it's real, make it relevant to me. I'll give you an example of that in a second. And give me hope that we can do something about it. If you leave any one of those three out, you're missing one leg of a three-legged stool, and you're going to tip over. You're not going to have success. Really brilliant case in point. I started doing a podcast last summer because I'm connected to enough scientists and business people and social scientists that when I call them and say, can I talk to you for a half hour in recording about some issue and put it on a podcast that's on iTunes, will you do it? And they say yes. So I get to talk to lots of interesting people. Today I recorded one I'm going to post on Saturday. There's a new report that says, guess what? Climate change is impacting winemaking areas. And most wine. Well, here's the scary part, or the really dramatic part. By the year 2050, 37 years from now, depending on where in the world you look, somewhere between 25 and 73% of the winemaking regions will no longer be suitable for growing premium wine, making wine. And it will have to happen in new places, and the new places that this goes will impact the environment and conservation in those places. So I interviewed the scientist who led that research and a winemaker from Napa who's trying to come to grips with what this means. Here's a case where, and the winemaker said this to me, he said, there's so much abstraction about climate change, all of a sudden it's landing right on my doorstep, and I have to act on it because it affects my life right here and right now. That's the relevance part. And then a lot of what we ended up talking about is there any hope? What can you do to adapt? What can you do to move? How do we protect the wildlife in the places that you're headed? Will there still be a wine industry in California 40 years from now? Right? Really fascinating. And you might, so to get to it, tombowman.com, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. Or not, your choice. Thank you.